Over the winter, I did my usual hibernate. Snuggle under blankets, watch period dramas, and make woolly things. Honestly, I could quite happily do that now. After endless months of rain, we have finally been blessed with glorious sunshine. And of course, I have a cold, so apologies if I sound a little strange today. Usually, my winter makes involve simple knitted scarves, hats and arm warmers. This year, however, something happened. I developed a crochet obsession, more specifically a granny square obsession. It began innocently enough with a blanket. Then somehow the squares kept multiplying until I had made 3 waistcoats. Now thoroughly obsessed with waistcoats and feeling rather pleased with myself, I found an old knitting pattern tucked away in the loft, and I decided it was time to follow my first knitting pattern in years. Eventually victory was mine. I now had 4 waistcoats. Do I need 4 waistcoats? Absolutely not. Am I delighted with them? Entirely. Now, 3 of these waistcoats needed buttons. And me being me, I decided to make my own. My first thought was Bilbo's waistcoat buttons from the films. Beautiful brass buttons with lovely acorn details. They are round and slightly weighty looking, and of course would need some kind of fixing on the back so they could actually be sewn onto the waistcoat. So I rummaged through my button stash, purely for research purposes of course, and checked sizes and shapes for inspiration. I knew the first step would be making a model so I could create moulds moving forwards. Beyond that, I had absolutely no plan, which, if we're honest, is usually where the fun begins. I picked out some plain buttons around the right size and used 2-part epoxy putty to sculpt little acorn details onto the tops, attaching them to the button bases before the putty set so they bonded together nicely. I made 2 different sizes to suit the waistcoats. Then I wondered, what if I made just the acorn without the button base? And then, as often happens with woolly projects, I got slightly carried away. If I was making buttons, what style would suit me? Of course, the answer was obvious: trees. I found some tree and leaf charms hiding in my bead box and chose 2 that I thought would work beautifully with a brass finish. These were wonderfully simple to make: a quick trim of the loop, a little sanding and glued straight onto the button bases. Easy for once. To make the moulds I used a 2-part mould putty. It's a little more expensive, but the buttons are quite small and I didn't need much. I simply pressed the button masters upside down into the putty and left them to cure. Now came the interesting part. How exactly was I going to make the actual buttons? From past experience, I knew UV resin mixed with mica powder wouldn't work here. The amount of mica needed for a metallic effect would stop the UV light curing all the way through, and I couldn't colour the epoxy putty enough to get the brass finish I wanted either. So my only option, or at least the only one my brain could think of at the time, was 2-part epoxy resin mixed with mica powder. Now I'm a tad impatient and usually reach for UV resin wherever possible, but this time I had no choice but to wait overnight for the resin to cure. This did at least give me time to add jewellery rings to the toothpicks and suspend them in the backs so they would set in place while curing. following morning, disappointment. They were dull, not shiny, not glorious, just sad. I tried sanding and polishing them, hoping to coax out some shine, but this was softening the details and still not giving me the finish I wanted. So, thinking cap back on. And then I remembered, at the back of my cupboard, yes, the magic cupboard where all mysterious craft supplies and questionable hoarding decisions live, I had some real copper powder. I had used this many moons ago with resin and remembered promising results. So I opened a window, put on my gloves and a mask and mixed up a batch. Then I added what I can only professionally describe as a suck it and see quantity of copper powder and waited to see what happened. At first these looked dull too, but unlike the mica powder, the copper had travelled right through the resin, and goodness me, they were tough, heavy too, just like real metal buttons. These stood up to sanding beautifully and I loved the results. I even topped up some of the moulds with the leftover batch because by this point I was thoroughly button drunk. Just remember to wear a mask when sanding these too. I realised I needed 5 buttons per set. This was going to take me forever, so to speed things up I made another batch of moulds. Now I had a plan. I bought both bronze and brass powders to see whether I could get closer to Bilbo's movie buttons. In the end, I chose brass and followed the same process again. Once sanded and polished, I mixed up a homemade version of rub and buff, using shoe polish and mica powder to give them that lovely aged finish. And finally, the moment of truth. I sewed them onto the waistcoats, and I honestly think they are the perfect finishing touch. As for the tree buttons, You shall have to wait till next time to discover what fabulous creation these were destined for. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to be back to sounding normal soon. Bye bye and see you next time.